The sun had just begun its slow descent, painting the suburban streets in gold and shadow. Everything looked peaceful on the surface: manicured lawns, freshly painted fences, children playing in driveways, but behind the polished exterior, secrets festered. And in one quiet cul-de-sac, the kind where everyone knew each other's names, a storm was quietly brewing. At the center of it all was Eleanor Parker, the wife of the HOA president, Thomas Parker. Eleanor was known in the neighborhood for her charm, her elegance, and her unwavering dedication to keeping the streets safe. She smiled at neighbors, attended every meeting, and volunteered for every local charity. But beneath her pristine appearance, a darker side lingered, one that none of her neighbors could imagine. It began on a Thursday afternoon. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass, and the streets were unusually quiet. Eleanor drove her black SUV through the cul-de-sac with deliberate slowness, her dark sunglasses hiding her eyes. She parked in front of the old Henderson house, a property that had been abandoned for months. The front gate squeaked as she pushed it open, revealing a cracked pathway overgrown with weeds. No one had lived here for weeks, and yet Eleanor's steps were purposeful, almost ritualistic, as if she were performing a task that only she understood. Inside, she pulled something from her leather bag, a neatly folded uniform, not just any uniform. It was a police outfit, complete with a badge and a utility belt. Eleanor's hands trembled ever so slightly as she smoothed the fabric over her body, zipping it up with a precision that suggested she had done this before. She glanced in the dusty mirror, checking the reflection of the woman she had become, the woman nobody would suspect. The first call came like a whisper over the radio in her bag. A neighbor had reported a suspicious vehicle near the cul-de-sac. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She wasn't just going to observe, she intended to intervene. Slipping the radio into her pocket, she stepped back into the sunlight, the black uniform making her appear more formidable than she had ever seemed as Eleanor Parker, HOA president's wife. Her first encounter was with young Marcus Fields, a teenager known for minor pranks and restless energy. Marcus had been trying to skate down the hill when Eleanor blocked his path. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice firm, carrying the authority of someone who belonged to law enforcement. "You need to stop immediately." Marcus froze. He had seen police officers before, but something about her presence was different, eerily convincing. "Oh yeah, okay ma'am," he stammered, sliding off the skateboard. Eleanor nodded, her eyes scanning the empty street, her senses alert. She made a mental note: confidence is key, never hesitate. But Eleanor's actions weren't limited to minor interventions. Over the next few days, she escalated her presence. She parked her SUV near the community center, watching families gather, neighbors chatting, and the HOA board members finishing up a routine meeting. When she spotted someone littering, she confronted them. When a teenager was loud near the park, she issued a warning. Each time, her performance was flawless, leaving no room for suspicion. Behind closed doors, however, her husband Thomas was unaware. He spent long hours handling HOA issues, fielding complaints, and preparing monthly reports. Eleanor had perfected the art of appearing supportive, always at his side during meetings, smiling, nodding, reinforcing his authority. To him, she was the perfect partner, the ultimate ally. But every evening when Thomas returned home, Eleanor would slip out in her uniform and patrol the streets under the cover of dusk. Her double life was exhilarating, intoxicating even. The sense of control, the thrill of authority, and the fear she could instill in others became addictive. Eleanor thrived on the whispers of recognition from neighbors who believed they had encountered a real officer. She had perfected the art of deception to the point that even casual conversations made others confide in her. "I didn't know who else to call," one worried neighbor said. "Thank you for being here." But secrets, no matter how well hidden, have a way of unraveling. It started with the Henderson property again. Eleanor had been investigating supposed break-ins that never existed, convincing herself that the neighborhood needed her vigilance. She prowled the shadows of the property one night, flashlight in hand, when a figure appeared at the corner of the yard. The intruder was small, fast, and careful, someone who didn't want to be seen. Eleanor shouted, identifying herself as a police officer, her voice cutting through the night. The figure froze, then bolted. Eleanor chased, her heart pounding, adrenaline rushing. She cornered the figure near the fence, flashlight illuminating the terrified face of a man in his 40s. "Who are you?" Eleanor demanded, the badge on her chest gleaming under the flashlight. The man stammered, I was just walking my dog." Eleanor didn't believe him. She pressed on, questioning, intimidating, every word calculated to assert control. And then in a moment she hadn't anticipated, the man's phone rang. He answered quickly, muttering into it, and Eleanor caught a snippet of conversation. "Yes, she's outside, posing as an officer." Eleanor froze, her chest tightened, and for the first time doubt crept in. Someone had noticed. Someone was aware of her deception. The man looked at her with a mixture of fear and recognition. "You're not a real officer, are you?" he whispered. Eleanor's mind raced, but before she could respond, he bolted through a side gate, disappearing into the night. The next morning, whispers spread like wildfire. A neighbor had posted on the community forum a vague warning about someone dressed like the police patrolling the streets. Panic didn't set in immediately, but curiosity did. Thomas noticed the chatter, his brow furrowing. "Eleanor, did you know anything about this?" he asked casually, trying not to alarm her. Eleanor smiled, carefully measured. "Just a coincidence, I suppose, probably some overactive imagination." But her heart raced. She knew it wouldn't be long before someone dug deeper. That same evening, a knock echoed through the Parker household. Eleanor opened the door to find a uniformed officer standing there, not from the local precinct she had impersonated, but from the county sheriff's department. His badge gleamed in the porch light. "Good evening, ma'am," he said. "We've received reports of someone impersonating law enforcement in this neighborhood. May we come in and ask a few questions?" Eleanor's mind spun. She had rehearsed for curiosity, suspicion, and minor inquiries, but not this. She invited him in, keeping her voice calm, her hands steady, her smile intact. The officer asked about her activities, the late-night patrols, and her supposed interventions. Eleanor offered vague answers, emphasizing her volunteer work with neighborhood safety, keeping everything as plausible as possible. But the officer wasn't convinced. He left with a warning, advising her to refrain from any actions that could be construed as law enforcement. Eleanor watched him go, heart-pounding, but she didn't retreat completely. Something inside her refused to give up the thrill, the illusion of power, and yet she realized this was no longer a harmless game. She had crossed a line, and now someone else knew. The neighborhood, once quiet and predictable, had shifted. Whispers followed her like shadows. Children eyed her suspiciously, parents cast wary glances, and HOA members started to notice her absences during crucial daytime meetings. Eleanor tried to maintain her composure, but the tension was palpable. She was on the edge, balancing between the thrill of her double life and the looming threat of exposure. Late one night, Eleanor sat by the window, staring out at the empty street. The uniform hung in the closet beside her, a silent reminder of the power she wielded and the danger it represented. Somewhere out there, someone knew. And she knew deep down that the next move would define everything: her reputation, her marriage, and the fragile control she had built over the neighborhood. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she planned. Every patrol, every interaction, every word spoken as a police officer had to be flawless. The game had changed. Someone had caught a glimpse of the truth, and Eleanor understood one simple fact: the thrill of deception came with consequences, and in a world where appearances were everything, consequences could be devastating. As dawn broke, Eleanor Parker donned her uniform one more time, stepping into the streets with confidence, yet with a shadow of doubt creeping behind her eyes. The story of the HOA president's wife had taken a new turn, one that would ripple through every household in the cul-de-sac, leaving secrets exposed and trust shattered. And somewhere in the quiet corners of the neighborhood, someone was watching, waiting for her next mistake. The stage was set, the tension was real, and Eleanor's next move would either cement her power or destroy everything she had worked so hard to conceal. The sun rose over the cul-de-sac, oblivious to the drama unfolding beneath its golden light. The cul-de-sac had never felt colder. Even the morning sun seemed muted, as if hesitant to illuminate what was quietly unraveling behind closed doors. Eleanor Parker walked with her usual measured steps, the black uniform clinging to her like a second skin. Her reflection shimmered in the polished windows of the houses she passed. She looked every bit the authoritative officer the neighborhood believed her to be, but the truth weighed heavily in her mind. Earlier that morning, she had received an anonymous text. "We know, watch your next move." The sender was unknown, the number untraceable. Her heart had raced the moment she read it. Someone was watching. Someone had been observing her double life closely. Her careful choreography of deception now hung by a thread, and Eleanor's instincts screamed that the balance she had maintained so effortlessly was about to collapse. Her first stop was the community center, where children played under the watchful eyes of their parents. Eleanor scanned the perimeter, noting the usual suspects: Mrs. Caldwell with her gardening gloves, Mr. Patel checking his emails on a bench, teenagers lingering too close to the basketball court. All eyes were on her as she walked past, but no one spoke. Eleanor knew better than to underestimate the power of observation. In this neighborhood, gossip traveled faster than police reports ever could. She paused near the playground, crouching to adjust the swing of a small child. "Be careful," she said, her voice carrying a calm authority. "I'm here to keep everyone safe." The child smiled, oblivious to the tension beneath the surface, and Eleanor felt a fleeting surge of satisfaction. For a moment, it was easy to forget the web she had woven, the lies that underpinned every smile and nod from neighbors. But that illusion was shattered the instant she noticed a dark figure leaning against a tree, phone in hand, filming her every move. Eleanor's blood ran cold. The figure disappeared almost immediately, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the nagging sense of being exposed. Her mind raced. Was it the man from the Henderson house or someone else entirely? She couldn't risk confrontation. She needed information first. Every step she took now was calculated, every glance measured. The game had changed, and Alina knew she was being forced to play by someone else's rules. Back at the Parker residence, Thomas was in his office, oblivious to the tension building outside. He glanced at the community forum on his laptop, frowning at the rising chatter. "Alina, have you seen this?" he asked, pointing at a thread with blurry images of a woman in black approaching a teenage boy. Someone claiming to have seen a fake officer. Alina's heart skipped a beat, but her smile remained steady. "It's probably just a misunderstanding," she said, her voice smooth. "People like to exaggerate, you know how neighbors can be." Thomas nodded, unconvinced, and returned to his paperwork. But Alina knew that the facade was cracking and the threat was no longer hypothetical, it was real and immediate. That evening she donned her uniform again, venturing out under the dim glow of streetlights. The streets were quieter than usual, almost eerily so, and Alina moved with the precision of someone trained in anticipation. Her destination was the old Henderson property, the epicenter of her first close encounter with exposure. She approached cautiously, flashlight sweeping the perimeter. Every rustle of leaves, every shadowed corner seemed amplified. Then she saw him, the man who had confronted her weeks ago. He was crouched behind a fence, phone raised, recording her again. Alina's pulse quickened. "Why are you following me?" she demanded, her voice firm yet controlled. The man froze and then, almost mockingly, waved before disappearing into the darkness. Alina's mind raced. Someone was orchestrating this, someone knew enough to manipulate the situation. She realized then that the anonymous message wasn't just a warning, it was a prelude, a setup for something bigger. Her actions had consequences beyond her control, and she was no longer the hunter, she was the hunted. Over the next few days, the neighborhood became a labyrinth of suspicion. Alina noticed cameras installed at various corners, subtle movements that betrayed observation. The teenagers, once a minor nuisance, now lingered purposefully, whispering to each other with knowing glances. Even adults seemed different, furtive, cautious. Their eyes following her like shadows. Alina tried to maintain the illusion, but the cracks were widening. One afternoon, as she patrolled near the cul-de-sac's edge, she noticed a car parked unusually close to the intersection. It was an unmarked sedan, tinted windows reflecting the sunlight. Alina's instinct screamed that this was no coincidence. She approached cautiously, hands hovering near the radio in her pocket, only to see the silhouette of a man stepping out, mid-30s, tall, with an expression that was neither friendly nor threatening, just deliberate. "Mrs. Parker," the man said, his voice steady. "We need to talk." Alina froze, the uniform suddenly feeling heavy on her shoulders. "Who are you?" she asked. The man smiled faintly. "Let's just say I've been observing. You're very good at what you do, but you're not untouchable." The man revealed that he had been documenting her activities for weeks. Every patrol, every interaction, every minor act of authority had been recorded, and now he was ready to leverage that information. Alina felt the weight of exposure pressing down, the adrenaline mixing with fear. For the first time, she realized that her actions could have legal consequences, social consequences, and, perhaps most importantly, personal consequences. Her carefully curated image, her marriage, her standing in the community, all at risk. The conversation ended ambiguously, with the man warning her to expect a visit if she didn't cease her activities. Alina returned home, heart pounding, the darkness of the evening pressing against her. She couldn't tell Thomas, he would never understand, and the shame, the humiliation was unbearable. Yet she also knew that ignoring the threat was impossible. Someone was actively dismantling the life she had built, and Alina had to strategize. That night, Alina couldn't sleep. She reviewed every move she had made, every interaction, and every step taken in her double life. The thrill of impersonation had been intoxicating, but now it was toxic, a poison seeping into every corner of her existence. She realized that to survive, she had to escalate. She couldn't just hide, she had to regain control. The next day, Alina staged an elaborate patrol at the community center, making sure to be seen by as many neighbors as possible. Her every movement was precise, calculated to reinforce her authority and distract from the mounting suspicion. But the man in the sedan was waiting, just out of sight, documenting every detail. Alina felt the invisible gaze on her, the weight of exposure pressing closer with each passing hour. By evening, the tension reached a breaking point. Alina returned home exhausted mentally and emotionally. She sat by the window, staring at the cul-de-sac, watching shadows stretch across lawns. The thrill that had once driven her now felt like a trap closing in. She understood that her life was at a crossroads. Either she found a way to outmaneuver the observer, or everything she had built would collapse. In the quiet, a new sound emerged, a subtle click of a camera, a whisper of movement in the bushes. Eleanor's instincts flared. She wasn't alone. Someone was outside, watching, waiting, and the stakes had never been higher. The neighborhood, once a backdrop of mundane civility, had transformed into a battlefield. Trust was fractured, secrecy was currency, and Eleanor Parker was at the center, caught between the thrill of deception and the threat of revelation. The lines between hunter and hunted blurred with every passing day, and the pressure was suffocating. Eleanor's reflection in the window stared back at her, a stranger wearing a familiar face. She had played the role of authority with skill, charm, and audacity, but now she was on the edge. Every step, every choice could determine not just her future, but the fragile stability of the entire neighborhood. And then, just as she began to consider her next move, a knock shattered the stillness of the night. Eleanor's heart leapt. The visitor was unknown, but the timing was deliberate. Whoever it was, they had crossed the line from observer to instigator. And in that instant, Eleanor understood one chilling truth. The game had escalated beyond anything she had anticipated, and there was no turning back. The door creaked open. A figure stepped into the porch light, silhouette sharp against the darkness. Eleanor's breath caught, her instincts screaming. She had been caught. The next move would define everything: her power, her secrets, and perhaps even her safety. The story of the HOA president's wife had reached its tipping point. The neighborhood, once a peaceful illusion, had transformed into a stage for suspense, deception, and danger. And Eleanor Parker was about to discover that in a world built on appearances, one mistake could bring it all crashing down. The porch light flickered as Eleanor Parker stood frozen, staring at the figure on her doorstep. The man's silhouette was imposing, yet calm, deliberate. He didn't speak immediately, letting the tension stretch thin like a taut wire. Eleanor's mind raced, analyzing every possibility. Was he one of the law enforcement officers she had impersonated, a private investigator, or worse, someone with malicious intent ready to expose her? Finally, he spoke. "Mrs. Parker, you know why I'm here." His voice was low but sharp, precise. Eleanor's chest tightened. She had anticipated many scenarios, but confrontation in her own home was not one of them. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, keeping her tone measured, though her hands trembled slightly. The man stepped closer, revealing his face in the porch light. Recognition struck Eleanor instantly. It was the man from the Henderson house, the same one she had confronted weeks ago, but now he carried more than knowledge, he carried leverage. "You've been playing a dangerous game," he said. "You've lied, intimidated, and impersonated authority, and now everyone's watching." Eleanor's mind raced. She needed a strategy, a way to regain control. "If you think you can scare me into stopping, you're mistaken," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled a small folder from his coat, handing it to her. Inside were photos: Eleanor in her black uniform, patrolling the streets, confronting neighbors, even recording minor confrontations with teenagers. Each image was precise, undeniable evidence of her deception. Her heart pounded as she flipped through the pages. Every calculated move, every moment she had believed was hidden, was now documented. She realized with a sickening clarity that her power had been an illusion built on shadows and lies. And now, those shadows had come to light. "I could take this to the authorities," the man said, voice calm but unwavering. "You could face legal consequences. Your reputation, your marriage, your position, all of it could be gone in a single afternoon." Eleanor's mind spun. The thrill of her double life had blinded her, made her arrogant, and now it threatened to destroy everything she valued. Yet Eleanor was nothing if not resourceful. A flicker of determination passed through her eyes. "And what do you want?" she asked, her tone shifting from fear to negotiation. The man smiled faintly. "I want you to stop, but I also want you to understand the danger you've created. This isn't just about you. The neighborhood, the HOA, even your husband, everyone is at risk if this continues." Eleanor swallowed hard. He was right. She had convinced herself that her actions were harmless, even heroic. But reality had a way of piercing illusions. Her adrenaline was replaced with a cold clarity. She had gone too far, and the consequences were unavoidable. The man left shortly after, but the visit left a mark deeper than any warning could. Eleanor felt exposed, vulnerable, and strangely exhilarated by the tension. For the first time, she understood the thin line between control and chaos. Over the next few days, Eleanor's behavior shifted. She maintained her public persona flawlessly, attending HOA meetings, smiling at neighbors, and volunteering at local events. But privately, she planned, strategized, and prepared for every possible confrontation. The threat was no longer hypothetical. It was a tangible force shaping every decision she made. Her husband, Thomas, remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing at home. He continued his routine, organizing community events and managing HOA disputes, oblivious to the fact that his wife's carefully curated image of safety and authority was built on deception. Eleanor felt a pang of guilt, realizing that her actions could destroy not just her own life, but his as well. Then the neighborhood began to react. Rumors spread faster than Eleanor could contain. Parents whispered to each other, teenagers exchanged knowing glances, and even the HOA board members started noticing inconsistencies. Small incidents were reported, suspicious behavior, unexplained authority, minor interventions that didn't make sense. Every report, every suspicious glance added pressure, tightening the invisible noose around Eleanor's carefully managed life. One evening, Eleanor received another anonymous message. "Tonight, we see everything." Her pulse quickened. She knew the man from Henderson was orchestrating this, escalating the situation deliberately. She had no choice but to confront the impending exposure head-on. Eleanor waited until dusk, slipping into her uniform one last time. This would be the ultimate performance, the final act of control in a story that had spiraled beyond her grasp. She patrolled the streets with meticulous precision, every interaction calculated, every movement deliberate. Yet the shadow of observation never left her. She could feel it in the eyes of neighbors, in the subtle movements of passers-by, and in the hum of unseen cameras. Then she saw him. The man from Henderson stood at the edge of the cul-de-sac, phone raised, documenting everything. Eleanor's heart pounded, but her voice was steady. "You're done," she called out, not just to him but to the invisible audience she felt was watching her every move. The man smiled, unfazed. "Not yet," he replied. "Watch closely." Then, with a gesture, more figures emerged from the shadows, neighbors who had grown suspicious, teenagers who had documented encounters, even a few HOA board members. Eleanor's performance had been flawless in execution, but the audience had shifted. She was no longer in control. Panic threatened to rise, but Eleanor suppressed it. She realized that power, when built on deception, is fragile. The thrill of authority, the adrenaline of impersonation had been intoxicating, but now it was meaningless. What mattered was survival, honesty, and damage control. In the midst of the confrontation, Eleanor felt a wave of clarity. She had to admit the truth, not just to the man who had orchestrated the exposure, but to herself, to Thomas, and to the community she had manipulated. Every lie, every deception had led to this moment, and there was no turning back. Eleanor removed her sunglasses, revealing eyes that reflected fear, shame, and determination. She walked toward the gathered neighbors, her steps deliberate, her voice steady. "I have something to confess," she said. Silence fell. "I am not a police officer. I have been impersonating law enforcement, patrolling the neighborhood without authorization, and using fear as a tool to control situations. I was wrong, and I understand the consequences of my actions." Gasps echoed through the crowd. Some neighbors stared in disbelief, others in anger, and a few in admiration for her courage to confess. Eleanor's heart pounded, but the relief of honesty, raw and unfiltered, began to wash over her. Thomas arrived just in time, having noticed the gathering from his office. His face twisted with shock, confusion, and anger. "Eleanor, what have you done?" he asked, voice trembling. She met his gaze steadily. "I lost myself," she admitted. "I thought I was helping, but I crossed a line. I wanted control, authority, and I forgot who I am." The man from Henderson stepped forward, nodding. "Truth is the only way forward," he said. Eleanor nodded in agreement, understanding that exposure, while terrifying, could also be liberating. The aftermath was chaotic. Legal authorities were involved. HOA meetings became tense forums of discussion, and neighbors grappled with feelings of betrayal and empathy. Yet amidst the turmoil, Eleanor discovered something unexpected: resilience. By admitting her mistakes, she reclaimed a fragment of her humanity, acknowledging that even the most calculated deception cannot erase the consequences, but it can pave the way for redemption. That night, Eleanor sat alone in her home, the uniform folded neatly in a drawer. The adrenaline that had driven her days of deception had dissipated, replaced with exhaustion and clarity. She realized that power built on fear and lies is fleeting, but courage and honesty, though painful, endure. Outside, the neighborhood slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. Children played, neighbors conversed, and the cul-de-sac, though marked by scandal, began to heal. Eleanor Parker, the woman who had once walked in shadows, now faced a different challenge: rebuilding trust, understanding consequences, and reconciling with the life she had jeopardized. And somewhere in the quiet corners of the community, the man from Henderson watched, satisfied that the game had ended, but knowing full well that the lessons learned would linger, shaping the future of everyone involved. Eleanor's story had reached a turning point, but the echoes of deception, thrill, and revelation would resonate far longer than anyone could anticipate. The days that followed Alina Parker's confession were anything but peaceful. The neighborhood, once a sanctuary of suburban calm, had become a crucible of gossip, judgment, and whispered speculation. Every lawn, every mailbox seemed to carry the weight of scrutiny. Alina moved cautiously, aware that even a single misstep could undo the fragile threads of trust she was beginning to rebuild. Thomas Parker, her husband, had withdrawn into his office for long stretches, the anger and disappointment in his eyes barely concealed. He didn't speak much, but his silence was deafening. Alina knew she had to navigate not just the community's perception but the complex landscape of their marriage, now teetering between resentment and reconciliation. She hadn't only endangered her reputation, she had put their relationship on the line. The HOA meetings became tense battlegrounds. Board members and neighbors crowded the conference room, voices rising over petty grievances, accusations, and clarifications. Alina attended each session, answering questions with humility and honesty. She explained her motives, admitted her mistakes, and allowed herself to be held accountable. The process was grueling, emotionally draining, and yet oddly cathartic. She had expected anger, ridicule, and perhaps ostracization, but she found something she hadn't anticipated: a cautious respect for her courage to face the consequences. Outside the formalities, the man from Henderson, the observer, the instigator, continued to loom like a silent shadow. He remained a presence in the neighborhood, sometimes spotted discreetly watching Alina from a distance, ensuring that her confession wasn't merely performative. Though he had orchestrated her exposure, he also recognized that the truth, once revealed, could teach far more than fear ever could. Alina, in turn, grew to understand that he wasn't an enemy, but a force of accountability she had ignored for too long. One evening, Alina walked the cul-de-sac alone, her uniform long stowed away, replaced by a simple cardigan and jeans. The streets were calm, the laughter of children echoing faintly from the park. She noticed neighbors observing her, some curious, some wary, others still hurt. A few nodded politely, a tentative gesture of acknowledgement. Alina smiled faintly, understanding that rebuilding trust was a slow, painstaking process, one that couldn't be rushed or coerced. The impact of her actions reached further than she realized. Local authorities, upon reviewing the reports and photographs, were forced to intervene. Alina faced minor legal consequences for impersonation, and though the charges were not severe, the public record left a permanent mark on her reputation. She accepted this with quiet dignity, knowing it was a fair reflection of the choices she had made. Thomas, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile the woman he loved with the woman who had deceived an entire community. Their conversations were tense, occasionally heated, but gradually they began to confront the issues that had driven Alina toward her dangerous double life: her craving for control, the thrill of authority, and the unspoken dissatisfaction that had festered beneath the surface of their marriage. Therapy sessions, long walks, and late-night conversations became the scaffolding for rebuilding what had been fractured. It was not easy, it was not immediate, but slowly, understanding and empathy began to replace resentment. Neighbors, too, began to navigate the aftermath. Some withdrew, unable to reconcile Alina's deception with the woman they had trusted. Others became cautiously supportive, recognizing the honesty she had demonstrated once the truth emerged. The neighborhood, though forever altered, started to regain a semblance of normalcy. Children played in the streets again, HOA meetings continued, and the sense of community, fragile as it was, began to reconstruct itself piece by piece. The Henderson man who had initiated the exposure approached Alina one evening as she walked along the cul-de-sac. "You've done well," he said quietly, almost reluctantly. "Not everyone would have the courage to face what they've done so openly." Alina regarded him warily but with a note of gratitude. "Thank you," she replied. "I've learned that deception only holds power until it's exposed. Now I see how fragile control really is." He nodded and walked away, disappearing into the shadows once more. Alina realized then that the lessons of exposure were not just about fear, but about accountability, honesty, and the courage to confront one's own flaws. The man had been a catalyst, a mirror showing her the consequences of her actions, and she had finally chosen to face it. Months passed. Alina immersed herself in community work, volunteering openly, engaging with neighbors without pretense, and slowly rebuilding the trust that had been shattered. Thomas observed her transformation, recognizing the effort and authenticity behind each gesture. Their marriage, though scarred, grew stronger through shared honesty and renewed communication. The thrill of deception that had once driven Alina faded, replaced by a steady, measured understanding of responsibility and respect. The neighborhood itself healed in time. The initial shock of scandal gave way to curiosity, discussion, and ultimately forgiveness. While Alina's past actions could never be erased, the acknowledgement of wrongdoing and the tangible steps toward restitution softened the collective memory. Children continued to play, neighbors exchanged greetings, and the HOA meetings, once battlegrounds of suspicion, returned to their routine rhythm. Eleanor's reflection in the mirror no longer showed the woman consumed by thrill and secrecy. Instead, she saw someone tempered by experience, shaped by consequences, and aware of the delicate balance between influence and arrogance. She understood that power without accountability is hollow, and that genuine respect can only be earned through honesty and integrity. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Eleanor felt a quiet peace she had never known. The cul-de-sac, once a stage of deception and fear, now shimmered with cautious trust and the tentative rebuilding of community bonds. She had survived the storm, faced the consequences, and emerged with clarity. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. Eleanor glanced at it, expecting another warning, another threat. But the message was simple: "You've changed, don't forget the lessons." She smiled faintly, slipping the phone back into her pocket. The words were a reminder of the fragile nature of authority and the enduring strength of honesty. Eleanor rose and walked along the cul-de-sac one last time, taking in the houses, the streetlights, the sounds of life returning to normal. She understood now that the thrill she had sought in impersonation had been fleeting, a momentary illusion of control. What mattered now was substance, integrity, and the relationships she had jeopardized but could now nurture. Thomas joined her silently, taking her hand. No words were needed. The shared understanding between them spoke volumes. They had faced fear, deception, and exposure together and had survived. The cul-de-sac, the neighborhood, and their lives were forever changed, but within that change lay the possibility of redemption and genuine connection. As night fell, Eleanor Parker stood at the threshold of her home, looking out at the quiet streets. She had faced the consequences of her choices, confronted the shadows she had created, and emerged with a renewed sense of purpose. The HOA president's wife, once a figure of deception and thrill, had been unmasked, but in that unmasking she had found clarity, accountability, and the enduring strength of truth. The neighborhood had witnessed the fall of a false authority, but more importantly, it had seen the emergence of a woman willing to confront her mistakes, rebuild trust, and embrace the vulnerability that comes with honesty. Eleanor Parker had learned the hard way that the greatest power lies not in fear or control, but in the courage to face oneself and the consequences of one's actions. And as the cul-de-sac settled into the stillness of night, a faint sense of peace lingered, a promise that even in the shadow of scandal, redemption and growth were possible. The story of Eleanor Parker, the HOA president's wife who once pretended to be a police officer, had reached its conclusion. A tale of deception, thrill, exposure, and ultimately redemption. The cul-de-sac would never forget, but it had moved forward just as Eleanor had. And for the first time in months, she could finally breathe.